Imagine a world where what you wore wasn't just about warmth or modesty, but survival, status, identity. Long before closets, catwalks, or even cloth, humans needed to protect themselves, and soon they needed to express themselves. From stitched animal hides, to linen wrapped around ancient kings, to corsets, uniforms, streetwear, and beyond. Clothing has never stopped evolving, and neither have we. Tonight we'll follow the thread of history through time, how what we wear has shaped who we are, how we live, and how we see each other. From Ice Age hunters to medieval merchants to the age of fast fashion and digital dress codes. Before we get started, take a second to like the video and subscribe, especially if you enjoy slow, deep dives into big human stories. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's kind of magical how, stories like this can connect us across time zones, countries, and quiet rooms. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let the story carry you from start to sleep. Since the dawn of civilization, clothing has served a dual purpose: protection from the elements and a reflection of human identity. The story of fashion is more than just the evolution of fabrics and styles. It is a mirror of societal change, a symbol of status and values, and a language through which generations have expressed who they are. Understanding the history of clothing means stepping into the past to explore how necessity, creativity, technology, and culture have woven the very fabric of human expression. The reasons why humans wear clothes are deeply rooted in survival, modesty, and symbolism. Early humans clothed themselves to stay warm, to protect their skin from the sun and injuries, and eventually to signal social roles. Over time, clothing evolved into a powerful visual tool to distinguish between genders, social classes, professions, and even moods. As societies became more complex, so did fashion. It became a moving force, a cyclical yet ever changing stream of aesthetics shaped by politics, trade, religion, wars, and revolutions. Clothing also fulfills the need for beauty, individuality, and expression. The fabrics we wear, the colors we choose, and the silhouettes we favor speak volumes about our personal identity and the cultural context we inhabit. This journey through the ages will explore how fashion has morphed across continents and centuries, and more importantly, why these transformations occurred. Fashion is never static. It responds to the ebb and flow of economic pressures, to technological advancements like the invention of the sewing machine or the emergence of synthetic fibers, and to seismic shifts in politics and ideology. In this documentary, we will trace fashion's roots from prehistoric necessity to modern expression, examining the deeper reasons behind what we wear and how we wear it. Prehistoric clothing, survival, symbolism, and the origins of dress. Before the invention of written language, permanent cities, or organized religions, humanity clothed itself not in fashion as we think of it today, but in function. Prehistoric clothing, dating back to as early as 100,000 to 500,000 years ago, was born from the raw necessity of survival in often harsh, unforgiving environments. Yet even in these early garments, we see the first glimmers of creativity, identity, and symbolic expression, the foundations upon which fashion would later be built. Early hominids, living in the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age period, were hunter-gatherers exposed to the elements. As they migrated out of Africa and into colder climates, protection from the weather became paramount. The earliest known forms of clothing were likely animal hides, scraped clean of flesh and fur, and wrapped or draped around the body. There were no seams, no tailoring, just the instinctive use of available materials. These garments were likely tied with strips of sinew or vines, secured with primitive bone or wood pins. Over time, early humans developed tools that allowed for more sophisticated processing of hides. Flint scrapers were used to clean and soften animal skins. Bone needles enabled the creation of stitch clothing, an enormous leap forward. Archaeological discoveries from Upper Paleolithic Europe, such as at sites like Dolní Vestovnice in the Czech Republic, suggest not only fur clothing, but also the use of beads, pendants, and shells sewn into garments, evidence that clothing had already begun to express more than warmth. It expressed status, ritual, and social belonging. We also see early gendered clothing distinctions emerge. While both sexes would have worn practical garments suited to their environment, certain decorations or arrangements may have been used to signify fertility, age, or leadership roles within the tribe. Anthropologists believe that early body coverings were not just practical tools, but also cultural markers, deeply embedded with meaning. The Neolithic Revolution, beginning around 10,000 BCE, brought farming, permanent settlements, and textile innovation. As humans began to domesticate plants and animals, they discovered how to harvest plant fibers like flax, which could be spun into linen and later wool from sheep. The creation of spindles, looms, and dyeing techniques set the stage for truly woven garments. By the end of the Neolithic, clothing was no longer only about shelter, it was about technology, identity, and increasingly aesthetic choice. Mesopotamian clothing, drapery, class, and the fabric of civilization. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, was home to some of the world's first great civilizations: the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. Between roughly 3500 BCE and 500 BCE, this region pioneered writing, law, mathematics, and urban life. And along with these innovations came distinct and evolving styles of dress that reflected not just climate and materials, but also social hierarchy, gender, religion, and cultural ideals. The Mesopotamian climate was hot and arid, which shaped the type of clothing worn. Early Sumerians draped themselves in simple sheepskin skirts, worn with the wool facing outward, creating a textured, fuzzy appearance. These garments, called kaunakes, were often belted at the waist and wrapped around the lower body, leaving the upper torso bare, especially among men. Over time, as textile technologies improved, wool began to be woven and dyed, and clothing grew more refined. By the time of the Babylonians and Assyrians, clothing had become an important signifier of rank and propriety. Men typically wore long, fringed tunics or robes, belted at the waist and sometimes layered. The garments of priests and officials were more elaborately decorated and extended to the ankles, or even the floor. Fringes, a consistent motif in Mesopotamian dress, had both decorative and symbolic significance, perhaps suggesting order, movement, or divine protection. Women wore long gowns with wide sleeves, often covering their entire bodies. Modesty became increasingly emphasized in the later Babylonian period, especially among upper-class women. Jewelry, particularly made of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, played an essential role in completing an outfit. Both men and women adorned themselves with necklaces, bracelets, earrings, and even cosmetics. Mesopotamians were also among the first to use perfumes and oils, turning the body itself into a canvas of status and care. Clothing became more stratified with the rise of the bureaucracy and empire. Royalty and high-ranking priests might wear ornate embroidered robes, dyed in vibrant colors like red or purple, rare and costly due to the difficulty of extracting natural dyes. Servants and laborers, by contrast, wore simple tunics or skirts, often undyed and roughly sewn. Beyond status, clothing also conveyed piety. Religious rituals often required specific garments, and certain statues of gods and kings depict ceremonial robes adorned with symbols or sacred geometry. These designs were not purely aesthetic. They communicated a relationship between the wearer, the divine, and society at large. Ancient Egyptian clothing, linen, light, and the language of the gods. No civilization is more immediately associated with timeless elegance and visual consistency than ancient Egypt. Lasting for over 3,000 years, Egyptian fashion remained remarkably stable, shaped by environment, religion, and ritual. The blazing sun, scorching heat, and abundance of the Nile River's flax plants led to a clothing culture centered on one material above all: linen. Linen was ideal for Egypt's desert climate. It was light, breathable, and could be woven into fine, semi transparent sheets, creating garments that were both functional and ethereal. The most basic garment was the shenty, a wraparound skirt worn by men of all classes. For laborers and peasants, it was simple and practical. For pharaohs, nobles, and priests, the shenty was often pleated, starched, and finely embroidered, worn with wide belts, sashes, or aprons. Women's clothing consisted mainly of calasiris, long sleeveless linen dresses that clung to the body and extended to the ankles. Depending on rank, these could be nearly sheer or heavily adorned. Women often wore broad collars, gold jewelry, beaded nets, and winged diadems over their heads. Cosmetics were an essential part of attire. Kohl eyeliner, malachite eyeshadow, and henna were used not just for beauty, but also for magical protection and spiritual symbolism. Hair, too, was an important expression of identity. Wealthy Egyptians often shaved their heads for hygiene and wore elaborately styled wigs made from human hair, wool, or plant fiber. These wigs were perfumed with incense cones placed atop the head, slowly melting during ceremonies. Both men and women also practiced extensive body grooming, including depilation, scenting, and skincare. Clothing in Egypt carried religious meaning. Colors were symbolic: white for purity and sacredness, blue and green for life and regeneration, red for power and vitality. Specific styles were reserved for priests or the divine. The pharaoh wore the Names headdress, the uraeus cobra as a crown, and ritual garments during offerings. Mummification ceremonies required precise textiles, linen wrappings, amulets sewn into garments, and sacred vestments worn by the embalmers. Ancient Greek clothing, drapery, philosophy, and the pursuit of ideal beauty. In the cradle of Western civilization, fashion was not simply a matter of personal style or class identity. It was a reflection of philosophy, civic life, and the ideal of balance and harmony. The ancient Greeks, who flourished from roughly 800 BCE to 146 BCE, viewed clothing as an extension of both body and intellect. Their garments, simple in construction yet elegant in execution, became some of the most influential forms in the history of dress. Unlike the tailored styles that would later define medieval or Renaissance fashion, Greek clothing was fundamentally draped, not sewn. The primary garments, the chiton, the himation, and the peplos, were made from rectangular pieces of cloth, pinned, folded, and wrapped around the body in fluid, sculptural ways. This approach created a visual rhythm that mirrored Greek ideals of proportion, symmetry, and grace. The chiton was the most common garment, worn by both men and women. Made from linen or wool, it could be long or short, depending on the wearer's role and gender. A men's chiton was typically knee-length for ease of movement, especially among soldiers and workers. Women's chitons were longer, often reaching the ankles, and secured at the shoulders with fibulae, ornate pins or brooches. The waist was sometimes cinched with a belt, creating a blousing effect known as kolpos. The peplos, an earlier and more traditional garment, was worn primarily by women. It consisted of a large rectangular woolen cloth folded down at the top to create a double layer over the chest, called the apoptygma, then wrapped around the body and pinned at the shoulders. The peplos had a strong Doric character and was associated with archaic values, including modesty, strength, and civic virtue. Over the chiton or peplos, one might wear a himation, a heavier, cloak like wrap that draped over the shoulder and across the body. The himation conveyed a sense of dignity and was often worn by philosophers, statesmen, and elders. Its careful draping suggested a person of intellect and composure, in tune with the ideals of sophrosine, the Greek virtue of self control and wisdom. Another garment was the chlamys, a short cloak worn by soldiers and messengers. It was fastened over one shoulder and allowed for freedom of movement, practical but also a symbol of active masculine virtue. Depictions of heroic figures like Perseus or Hermes often include the chlamys, blending myth and military function. Color and pattern played a secondary but meaningful role in Greek clothing. While the base materials were often left in natural shades, white, beige, or ochre, wealthier citizens might wear dyed fabrics in muted hues, deep reds, indigos, and yellows. Embroidery was rare but existed, particularly along garment borders or in ceremonial attire. Greek art, particularly on black figure and red figure pottery, provides our best evidence for these subtle design elements. Jewelry and hairstyles completed the ensemble. Women wore diadems, necklaces, and bracelets, often crafted from gold, silver, or bronze. Hair was styled in braids, knots, or buns, sometimes adorned with ribbons or headbands. Men usually kept their hair short and beards neatly trimmed, in keeping with ideals of discipline and rationality. In Greek society, clothing was closely tied to citizenship and virtue. Public nudity, for example, was accepted, even idealized, in certain all-male environments, like athletic competitions, but completely unacceptable in civic or domestic contexts. The naked male body was seen as a form of divine perfection, sculpted like marble. For women, by contrast, modesty was a primary virtue, and female clothing often emphasized coverage and control. Religious festivals and dramatic performances also featured special costumes, often symbolic or theatrical. Priests and priestesses might wear white robes to signify purity, while actors on stage wore elaborate masks and garments to reflect the gods or tragic heroes they portrayed. What's remarkable about ancient Greek fashion is how little was required to make a lasting impression. With just a few yards of fabric and the right balance of folds and accessories, the Greeks created a sartorial language that endures to this day, echoed in everything from modern togas and graduation gowns to runway drapery and haute couture. Ancient Roman clothing, status, structure, and the art of authority. To understand Roman clothing is to understand the very nature of Roman civilization: methodical, rigidly hierarchical, and obsessed with visual order. From the early Republic to the heights of imperial grandeur, clothing in ancient Rome was not merely functional or aesthetic. It was a declaration of one's place in the social hierarchy, a manifestation of civic identity, and often a reflection of moral values and political ideology. Materials and the Roman textile industry. The Romans inherited textile techniques from the Greeks and Etruscans, but expanded them through empire-wide trade. The most common fabric in Roman clothing was wool, which was domestically produced and widely available. Roman households often spun their own wool, especially in the earlier Republican era, when the image of the ideal Roman matron included industriously weaving cloth for her family. In fact, the term lanificium referred both to wool working and to the domestic virtue of the Roman woman. For wealthier Romans, however, imported fabrics were prized. Linen, sourced from Egypt, was used for undergarments or lighter clothing, particularly in the warmer provinces. Cotton, imported from India, became more available in the late empire. And most famously, silk, brought overland via the Silk Road from China was a rare and luxurious commodity, at times restricted by law to elite women, and even later to the emperor himself. Silk was controversial; some Romans considered it decadent and effeminate. Seneca the Younger lamented how it rendered women nearly naked in public. Yet by the 1st century CE, silk had become a symbol of imperial splendor, a shimmering material that communicated both wealth and reach. The toga citizenship worn in fabric. No Roman garment is more iconic than the toga, the voluminous woolen drape that signified male Roman citizenship. Originally worn by both genders in earlier periods, the toga became, during the Republic, an exclusively male garment, tightly bound to political rights and civic status. The toga was a massive, semicircular piece of woolen cloth, often 18 feet, 5.5 meters, long, carefully folded and draped over the left shoulder, under the right arm, and across the body. It required skill to wear properly, and slaves often helped their masters don it correctly. The toga was cumbersome, ceremonial, and largely impractical for physical labor or extended movement. And that was the point. It signaled a man's freedom from manual toil, his status as a landowning citizen, and his ability to participate in public life. There were several types of togas, each with specific meanings. Toga virilis, toga of manhood, plain white, worn by adult male citizens. Toga praetexta, white with a purple border, worn by magistrates, senators, and freeborn boys before adulthood. Toga candida, bleached white and worn by political candidates, from which the word candidate derives. Toga pulla, dark colored, worn in mourning. Toga picta, elaborately embroidered, dyed purple and gold, worn by victorious generals during triumphs and later by emperors. The purple dye used, Tyrian purple, extracted from murex sea snails, was so costly and labor intensive that it became reserved for royalty and high office. In fact, during the imperial period, laws restricted the use of purple. Wearing it without permission could be considered treason, men's everyday dress. When not in formal settings, Roman men typically wore the tunica, a basic T-shaped garment sewn from wool or linen. It reached the knees, had short sleeves, and was belted at the waist. The length and fit of the tunic could signify occupation and status. Laborers wore shorter tunics for ease of movement, while senators' tunics had broad purple stripes, latus clavis, sewn vertically down the front, indicating senatorial rank. Wealthy men sometimes layered their tunics or wore cloaks such as the paenula, a heavy poncho-like cloak, or lacerna, a lighter, fashionable wrap fastened with a fibula. In colder climates, such as Britain or the Alpine provinces, additional layers like braca, woolen trousers, originally considered barbaric, were adopted by necessity, even if initially scorned by more traditional Romans. Women's clothing, virtue, modesty, and ornamentation. Roman women wore a layered ensemble of garments that combined modesty, elegance, and sometimes significant wealth. The foundational garment was the tunica interior, a linen or wool slip-like underdress. Over this, women wore the stola, a long sleeveless outer dress that often reached the ground. The stola was the feminine equivalent of the toga. It was the formal garment of a married, freeborn Roman woman. Unmarried women or prostitutes were not permitted to wear it. The stola was typically gathered at the waist, with a belt, and featured pleats and folds that emphasized a woman's virtue and domestic role. Over the stola, women might wear the palla, a large rectangular shawl that could be draped over the shoulders or pulled over the head in public, signifying modesty and matronly dignity. Women's clothing could be richly adorned. Wealthy Roman women had access to dyed silks, embroidered tunics, and elaborate jewelry, necklaces, fibulae, rings, and hairpins made of ivory, gold, or even imported gems. Hairstyles were a major social signifier. During the imperial period, intricate braids, curls, and wigs became fashionable, often requiring dedicated enslaved stylists known as ornatrices. Cosmetics and perfumes were widely used. Roman women applied white lead for skin lightening, rouge made from red ochre or cinnabar, and kohl for eyeliner. While some philosophers like Seneca criticized excessive makeup as immoral or artificial, beauty rituals remained deeply ingrained in elite feminine identity. Children's clothing and coming of age. Children wore simple tunics, similar to adults but shorter and often unbelted. Freeborn Roman boys wore the toga praetexta with a purple stripe until age 14, 16, when they underwent the ceremony of the toga virilis, marking their entry into adulthood and the rights of citizenship. Girls transitioned into wearing the stola upon marriage. Infants often wore amulets called bulla for boys or lunula for girls, thought to ward off evil spirits. These protective charms are made from leather, gold, or even amber, depending on the family's wealth. Military clothing, function, uniformity, and Roman power. Roman soldiers were highly organized and their clothing reflected both functionality and discipline. The basic military outfit included a woolen tunic, often dyed red, and a leather belt, cingulum. Over this they wore larica segmentata, segmented metal armor, or larica hamata, chainmail, depending on period and rank. Soldiers also wore caligae, heavy-duty hobnailed sandals designed for long marches. A military cloak, sagum, was fastened at the shoulder, providing warmth and protection from rain. The image of a well-armored, disciplined legionary in uniform tunic and breastplate was not just practical, it was a key part of Roman imperial identity. Soldiers were visual representations of Roman order, law, and dominance. Even in death, soldiers were often buried with parts of their uniform, reinforcing their eternal connection to the army and the state. Byzantine and early Christian clothing, faith, imperial splendor, and the birth of sacred fashion. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE and the survival of the Eastern Roman Empire, known to history as the Byzantine Empire, fashion entered a new era. In Byzantium, clothing became infused not only with Roman traditions, but also with Christian theology, imperial ideology, and Oriental opulence. The fusion of East and West, pagan legacy, and Christian piety created a unique visual culture, one where garments were not only worn, but revered. In the Byzantine worldview, clothing was a divine language, a way to express cosmic order, spiritual purity, and earthly hierarchy. Materials, techniques, and trade Byzantine textiles were some of the most luxurious in the medieval world. The empire controlled key trade routes linking the Mediterranean with the East, and this access brought silks from China, dye stuffs from India, and embroidery techniques from Persia and Egypt. Unlike earlier Roman simplicity, Byzantine garments were richly woven, dyed, and embroidered, often in complex geometric or symbolic patterns. Imperial workshops, known as gynecia, produced state-controlled cloth for aristocrats and court officials. These state looms ensured that certain designs and colors, especially imperial purple, remained the exclusive property of the emperor and his court. Byzantine silks were so prized that even foreign rulers, such as Charlemagne in the west, or the Abbasid caliphs in the east, desired them as diplomatic gifts. These fabrics became so symbolic of imperial legitimacy that possession of Byzantine silk could enhance the prestige of an entire foreign court. Men's clothing, tunics, cloaks, and imperial power. The basic male garment in Byzantium remained the tunica, but it was now longer and more elaborately decorated than in Roman times. The tunic extended to the ankles for formal occasions, with long sleeves, and was made from dyed silk or fine wool. Tunics were often adorned with clavi, vertical decorative bands running down the front, as well as orbiculi, round embroidered medallions. Over the tunic, noblemen and officials wore the chlamys, a semicircular cloak fastened over one shoulder with a jeweled brooch called a fibula. The chlamys was not only a fashion accessory, it was a court uniform worn during ceremonial audiences and state rituals. Its length, color, and ornamentation indicated rank, with gold thread and purple dye reserved for the elite. A more modest, practical cloak, known as the pallium, was worn by lower classes and religious figures. It evolved into the omophorion, a specific vestment worn by bishops and patriarchs in Christian liturgy. Byzantine men also adopted trousers, known as brays or sarabara, especially in military or northern contexts. These were often considered Eastern or barbarian, but became increasingly accepted due to practicality. The emperor fashion as divine manifestation. The Byzantine emperor was more than a political leader. He was believed to be God's representative on earth, and his clothing reflected that divine status. The emperor wore garments of lavish gold thread, jewel-encrusted crowns, and robes dyed in Tyrian purple, a color so sacred that it was illegal for anyone else to wear it without imperial permission. The phrase born in the purple, Greek porphyrogenetos, referred to children of emperors born in a special purple chamber in the great palace. These children had a higher claim to the throne simply by virtue of being surrounded, even at birth, by imperial color and cloth. Ceremonial dress included laroi, long tasseled scarves wrapped around the shoulders and chest, signifying imperial authority; fibulae, massive decorative brooches in gold or silver, often the size of a hand; jeweled belts and gem-encrusted collars, marking seniority in the court hierarchy; Byzantine mosaics, such as those in Ravenna's Basilica of San Vitale, offer vivid portraits of imperial dress, immortalizing the splendor of emperors like Justinian and empresses like Theodora. Women's clothing, sanctity, luxury, and the ideal of modesty. Byzantine women's fashion combined the modest drapery of early Christian values with the luxurious fabrics of Eastern court life. The core garment was the stola, or dalmatica, a long, wide-sleeved tunic worn over a chemise-like undergarment. These dresses were made of silk or fine wool and could be ornately patterned with floral, animal, or geometric designs. Wealthy women wore embroidered gowns and cloaks decorated with pearls, gold thread, and iconographic images of saints or angels. The layering of garments was both a fashion statement and a moral signifier. To cover the body was to guard the soul. Nudity, even artistic or mythological, was no longer acceptable in Christian society. Veiling became common. Married women often wore a maphorion, a long veil that covered the head and sometimes the shoulders, echoing the attire of the Virgin Mary in religious iconography. Hair was usually worn in braids, coiled into buns, or concealed entirely. Jewelry remained important. Byzantine women wore earrings, bracelets, diadems, and rings, often with religious motifs such as crosses or doves. Cosmetics were used in moderation, although frowned upon by conservative clergy. Records show women used kohl, red ochre, and scented oils to enhance their appearance. Clergy and ecclesiastical garments. Christianity brought a whole new class of sacred dress, vestments worn by priests, bishops, monks, and nuns. These garments symbolized spiritual purity, humility, and devotion, but also hierarchy and ritual function. Priestly robes often mirrored imperial garments, intentionally blurring the line between sacred and royal authority. Bishops wore the omophorion, a long embroidered scarf that signaled episcopal rank. The Stacharian, a wide tunic, Epitrachalian, a stole, and Phalonian, a liturgical cloak, became standard items in the clergy's wardrobe. Monks wore rough woolen robes, typically undyed and simple, reflecting their vows of poverty. Even the colors of vestments had theological meaning: white for purity and resurrection, purple for penitence and mourning, gold for celebration and divinity. These visual codes deeply influenced later medieval religious dress across Catholic, Orthodox, and Eastern Christian communities. Medieval fashion, faith, fabric, and feudal identity. The fall of the Western Roman Empire marked the beginning of the medieval period, a 1,000-year chapter in European history that stretched roughly from the 5th to the 15th century. It was an age of castles and cathedrals, knights and kings, saints and sinners, and throughout, clothing served as a quiet but powerful reflection of one's position in the divine and feudal order. Where Roman clothing emphasized citizenship and civility, medieval dress focused on hierarchy, virtue, and obedience. The materials people wore, the colors they could display, and even the shapes of their sleeves were subject not only to local custom and economy, but increasingly to religious doctrine and legal control. The peasant majority, practicality, and poverty. The vast majority of medieval Europeans were peasants, serfs, or rural laborers. Their clothing was simple, durable, and functional, a far cry from the silk brocades of the nobility. Men typically wore a tunic made from coarse wool or linen, falling just above or below the knees depending on climate and region. The tunic was belted at the waist, and over it, they might wear a short cloak, especially in colder regions. Legs were covered with hose, woolen wrappings, or left bare in warmer months. Feet, if covered at all, were usually wrapped in cloth or encased in leather shoes, or wooden clogs. Women's clothing echoed the same structure: a simple underdress made of linen, topped by a longer woolen overdress, often sleeveless or with wide sleeves. A head covering, usually a coif, kerchief, or veil, was worn at all times outside the home, signaling modesty and conformity. These garments were often uncolored or in natural shades of brown, gray, or muted green, as dyes were expensive and labor-intensive. Most clothing was homespun, made from wool sheared from local sheep and woven on hand looms in the village. Clothing was mended and patched repeatedly. Garments were not seasonal or stylish, but generational, passed down until threadbare. For medieval peasants, fashion did not change dramatically over centuries. Instead, it responded to weather, harvest cycles, and social obligations, with only modest shifts over time. The nobility, luxury, symbolism, and legal privilege. In contrast, the nobility, knights, lords, barons, and royalty, used clothing as a form of social armor. Every inch of their attire spoke to rank, lineage, and authority. A nobleman's wardrobe included a fine linen shirt worn beneath layers of wool or imported silk, a doublet or coat-hardie tailored close to the body, often buttoned or laced, tights or hose, sometimes brightly colored, often mismatched for flair, a surcoat, a sleeveless outer tunic emblazoned with heraldic symbols or family crests, and a cloak fastened at one shoulder with a gilded brooch or jeweled clasp. Fabrics included dyed wool, silk from Byzantium or Moorish Spain, velvet, and even ermine or squirrel fur for winter wear. Dyes were expensive: woad blue, madder red, and especially Tyrian or Kermes crimson signaled wealth. Embroidery was intricate, often done with gold thread and pearls. Noblewomen's clothing was equally elaborate. A typical lady might wear a chemise, undergarment, made of fine linen, a kirtle, a long-fitted dress often laced or buttoned up the front, a surcoat or gown, with long sleeves trailing to the floor, often called tippets, a headdress which evolved over time from simple veils to the towering hennons of the later Middle Ages. Hair was almost always covered, especially after marriage. Unmarried girls wore braids or loose hair under a modest veil, while older women wore wimples, barbettes, or even cages of wire supporting structured veils. Hats became increasingly elaborate by the 14th century. Noble fashion changed faster and more visibly than peasant clothing, influenced by courtly culture, foreign diplomacy, and emerging sumptuary laws. Legal codes restricting who could wear what, sumptuary laws, fashion as legal control. Beginning in the 13th century, European kingdoms passed sumptuary laws to enforce social hierarchy through dress. These laws banned lower classes from wearing certain fabrics, furs, or colors, under penalty of fines or even imprisonment. For example, in England, only nobility could wear ermine or imported silk. In Florence, middle class women were forbidden from owning more than one silk gown. In France, crimson or gold embroidery was restricted to royal bloodlines. These laws served multiple purposes. They reinforced class distinctions, discouraged conspicuous consumption among the rising merchant class, and, in theory, promoted Christian modesty. But they were often difficult to enforce. Wealthy burghers found ways to skirt restrictions by changing garment structure, using hidden linings, or bribing officials. Still, the laws underscore how deeply clothing was woven into power, identity, and control. Clothing and the church monastic simplicity versus clerical splendor. The Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, and its influence on clothing was profound. Monks and nuns dressed in garments reflecting vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity. Most monastic robes were made from undyed wool, often in brown, gray, or black. The Benedictines wore black habits, Cistercians wore white, and Franciscans adopted rough brown robes, tied at the waist with a simple rope. But paradoxically, higher ranking clergy, bishops, cardinals, and abbots wore garments of exquisite craftsmanship, reflecting their roles as leaders in both the spiritual and secular worlds. Liturgical vestments included the alb, a white linen robe, the chasuble, a decorated outer garment, the mitre, a tall pointed headdress, and the cope, a semicircular cloak fastened at the chest. These garments were often embroidered with biblical scenes, gold thread, and jewels, especially in cathedrals and papal courts. The contrast between monastic humility and ecclesiastical grandeur was not lost on critics. Reformers like the Lollards, and later the Protestants, pointed to clerical excess as evidence of moral decay. Technological shifts, from draping to tailoring, a major change in medieval fashion came with improvements in tailoring and textile production during the 12th to 14th centuries. Earlier medieval garments were largely rectangular or circular pieces of cloth, draped and pinned. But as tailoring tools advanced, including scissors, needles, and pattern drafting, clothing became more fitted, more articulated, and more expressive of the human form. Garments began to show, waistlines, emphasized by belts or lacing, sleeves, which could be removed or interchanged, buttons, used decoratively and functionally, gores, and gussets, which allowed for flared skirts and flexible movement. These innovations allowed fashion to become individualized, even among the middle classes. By the late 1300s, wealthy townspeople wore tight-fitting tunics, pointed shoes, and colorful fabrics, much to the irritation of the traditional elite. Knights, crusaders, and military fashion armors fashioned too, and the medieval knight was a walking ensemble of metal, leather, and heraldry. Early knights wore a chainmail hauberk over a padded undertunic called a gambeson. By the 14th century, plate armor emerged, articulated steel pieces covering the chest, limbs, and joints, culminating in the full suits of armor iconic to the late medieval period. Over the armor, knights wore surcoats displaying their family crest or allegiance. These symbols made them recognizable on the battlefield and in tournaments where fashion, honor, and spectacle converged. Clothing worn under armor, like the arming doublet, became fashionable in civilian life as well. The military look influenced general menswear, padded shoulders, belted waists, and structured silhouettes, all hint at the aesthetic of the knight, regional variations, and foreign influence. While we often speak of medieval fashion as a whole, styles varied across geography and time. For instance, in Normandy, clothing was more influenced by northern chill, longer cloaks, heavier wool, fur linings. In Spain, under Muslim rule, Christian fashion absorbed Moorish elements, wide sleeves, geometric embroidery, silk sashes. In Italy, urban centers like Florence and Venice introduced Renaissance influences early, with brighter colors and slimmer silhouettes. The Crusades also introduced new fabrics and styles. Crusaders returning from the Levant brought back cotton, patterned silks, and even turban like headdresses, which were reinterpreted in European styles. Renaissance and early modern fashion, rebirth, refinement, and the invention of style. As Europe emerged from the deep spiritual twilight of the medieval world, a new era of cultural awakening began to unfold. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, was not merely a rediscovery of classical antiquity, but a wholesale reimagining of human identity, artistic expression, and worldly life. Fashion, like painting and architecture, reflected this transformation. It became more than social signaling or modesty, it became an aesthetic philosophy. The way one dressed was no longer just about station or utility. So, it was about visibility, taste, intellect, and self fashioning. From the 15th to the 17th centuries, clothing underwent dramatic change. In the courts of Florence, Milan, Paris, and London, garments swelled with layers, colors deepened with imported dyes, and tailoring advanced to an unprecedented degree. This period witnessed the early foundations of what we might now recognize as modern fashion: personal style as performance, luxury as spectacle, and fabric as power made visible. The Renaissance began in Italy, and so did the earliest revolutions in dress. Italian city states were centers of trade, banking, and art patronage. Wealthy merchant families like the Medicis used fashion not only to display wealth but to assert cultural dominance. Men's clothing began to emphasize a broad, square silhouette. Doublets became tighter at the waist and were often padded at the chest and shoulders to give the wearer a more commanding posture. Sleeves became detachable and were often slashed or puffed to reveal colored linings beneath, a trend meant to echo both military strength and aesthetic refinement. Hose were worn tightly on the legs, sometimes with codpieces that grew in prominence during the 16th century, particularly in the courts of Northern Europe. These codpieces, originally practical, offering both protection and modesty, when tunics shortened, became absurdly exaggerated, symbolizing virility, power, and male vanity. Women's clothing also evolved dramatically. The female silhouette transformed into a highly structured form with controlled geometry. The ideal female figure was no longer hidden in flowing fabric, but sculpted through clothing. Bodices were laced tightly to flatten and raise the bust, and skirts widened with the help of petticoats or early hoop structures. Gowns were layered over kirtles and chemises, and sleeves were detachable, interchangeable, and heavily adorned. In Florence, women favored rich brocades, deep jewel tones, and fabrics such as velvet, silk damask, and cloth of gold. Necklines varied, square, rounded, or modestly high, often depending on marital status and local customs. Hair was often styled upward, off the neck and forehead, with braids coiled into buns or hidden beneath bejeweled nets called cauls. Pearls were especially favored, both for their association with purity and their reflective quality in candlelight. Color symbolism remained important, but became increasingly personal and expressive. Reds, purples, and golds still signaled power, but now pastels and natural tones appeared in portraiture and everyday court attire. Dyes were increasingly imported from across the globe: indigo from India, cochineal red from the New World, and saffron from the East, making color not just an expression of wealth, but of global connectedness. The age of exploration was also the age of exotic textiles. Contact with Asia, the Americas, and the Islamic world transformed European wardrobes. Silks from the Ottoman Empire, muslins from India, and feathers and beads from the Americas began appearing in high status dress. European tailors copied and hybridized styles from other cultures. Turban inspired headwear, Eastern sashes, and even Moroccan slippers were briefly fashionable in the wealthiest circles. The global circulation of goods was giving birth to a globalized aesthetic. The idea of national dress also began to take form during this period. The French court under Francis I promoted specific cuts and tailoring as expressions of French elegance. The Spanish court under Charles V and Philip II influenced fashion across Catholic Europe with its rigid, severe silhouettes, especially for women, whose dresses became increasingly architectural. Spanish gowns introduced the farthingale, a hooped petticoat that extended the width of skirts dramatically. Spanish black, dyed with iron-rich oak galls, became a symbol of religious devotion and political power. In contrast, English fashion, especially under the Tudor monarchs, was extravagant and theatrical. Under Henry VIII, men's garments became voluminous, with wide shoulders, slashed sleeves, and ostentatious use of fur and embroidery. Under Elizabeth I, English court dress became a political weapon. The Queen's own wardrobe was a masterpiece of symbolism. She appeared painted in white, clothed in silver, covered in pearls, as the Virgin Queen, the body of the nation itself. Her iconic ruffs, towering collars of starched linen or lace, framed the face like halos. Elizabethan dress for both men and women was a precise visual code. It spoke of order, control, virtue, and spectacle. A well-dressed body was a controlled body. Tailoring advanced rapidly in this period. For the first time, garments were cut according to individual measurements and shaped with curved seams and darts. Linings, interlinings, and padding allowed clothing to take sculptural forms. Sewing became more professionalized. Tailors belonged to guilds, followed apprenticeships, and guarded trade secrets. Fashion was no longer only a domestic craft, it was an industry centered in cities, powered by luxury, and aimed at creating newness. Sumptuary laws continued to govern clothing across Europe, but they were increasingly challenged. As wealthy merchants rose in power, particularly in cities like Venice, Antwerp, and London, they pushed back against aristocratic restrictions. Their daughters wore imported silks, their sons rode through city squares in gilded cloaks. The boundaries between classes were blurred by fashion, and governments struggled to maintain visual hierarchies. In response, portraits began to emphasize wealth in subtler ways. A simple black gown might be made of silk velvet and paired with 20 rings, a gold chain, and a fur-trimmed cape. Minimalism, paradoxically, became a mark of refined luxury. One of the most fascinating developments of the Renaissance period was the rise of fashion as a published idea. Clothing, for the first time in Western history, began to be documented, discussed, and illustrated in books. Costume books like Cesare Vecellio's Degli Habiti Antici et Moderni di tutto il mondo, published in 1590, cataloged the dress of peoples across the known world. These texts were not just artistic curiosities, they served as fashion manuals, status symbols, and political commentaries. They allowed elites to compare themselves to others and to stage their difference as both cultural superiority and divine favor. Another important development was the gendering of color and style. While both men and women had worn vibrant hues in the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, by the 17th century men's fashion began to move toward darker, more muted tones. Black, navy, and brown replaced the pinks, oranges, and greens of earlier decades. This shift was partly influenced by Protestant values, especially in Northern Europe, where humility and restraint were virtues. But it also reflected a growing idea that masculinity should be sober, rational, and serious, while femininity remained decorative, colorful, and fluid. Clothing also became increasingly seasonal and occasion specific. Court calendars determined when and how to change wardrobes. Mourning dress became standardized. Special garments were commissioned for weddings, baptisms, and coronations. The wardrobe of a noble household included dozens of garments for each individual, as well as an army of servants, dressers, and tailors responsible for maintaining them. By the end of the Renaissance and into the early modern period, the foundations for modern fashion were clearly laid. The idea that clothing could define identity, express political values, and convey cultural sophistication had taken firm root. Fabric had become language, and the body a canvas. Clothing was no longer just worn, it was curated, designed, and performed. Baroque fashion, grandeur, excess, and the theater of power. As the 17th century progressed, a new visual language began to shape the clothing of Europe's elite, a style characterized by bold contrasts, theatrical flourishes, and a fascination with motion and drama. This was the Baroque era, a period that brought with it not only political centralization and religious conflict, but also a new approach to the human body, luxury, and visibility. In fashion, Baroque taste favored abundance. Garments billowed, shimmered, and swayed with each movement. Clothing was no longer simply an extension of status or morality. It became an instrument of spectacle, used by courts and individuals alike to stage identity, wealth, and divine authority in increasingly elaborate ways. The Baroque period, roughly spanning from the early 1600s to the early 1700s, was deeply influenced by political shifts. In particular, the rise of absolutist monarchies, such as that of Louis XIV of France, profoundly affected how fashion was worn, controlled, and understood. Under Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, clothing became part of a courtly theater, a continuous, carefully managed performance of rank and favor. Versailles was not just a royal residence, it was a catwalk for nobility, where one's placement in line, one's access to royal dressing rituals, and one's appearance in formal garments could make or break a political career. For men, Baroque fashion saw the rise of the juste au corps, a long-sleeved, knee-length coat that replaced the earlier doublet. Worn over a matching waistcoat and breeches, the juste au corps created a vertical silhouette that emphasized elegance and movement. Fabrics were luxurious, patterned silks, velvets, and brocades dominated, often embroidered in gold or silver thread. Buttons were decorative as well as functional, sometimes made of metal, mother of pearl, or enamel. Lace, especially around the cuffs and cravat, the precursor to the modern necktie, framed the face and hands, drawing attention to gestures and facial expressions, crucial tools in a society where social performance was everything. Men's hair became longer and more styled. The periwig, or powdered wig, became a central element of elite male fashion. These wigs were not merely practical, but symbolic. The larger and more elaborately curled the wig, the higher the status of the wearer. They required maintenance, powdering, and often the labor of specialized wig makers. Over time, powdered wigs would become mandatory in many European courts, especially in formal settings. Women's fashion in the Baroque period was no less dramatic. Gowns became architectural masterpieces, made from stiffened bodices and structured skirts that projected outward from the waist with the help of whalebone, padded rolls, or farthingales. Sleeves extended to the elbow and often ended in flounces or tiers of lace called engagiantes. The neckline was usually wide and low, exposing the shoulders and upper chest, a deliberate display of both wealth and erotic appeal, tempered by the modesty of lace fichus or delicate linen kerchiefs. The mantua, a new style of gown, emerged in the later part of the 17th century. It was originally a loose overdress worn informally, but it soon evolved into a formal garment, worn over a coordinating petticoat and featuring an open front that revealed the elaborate underlayer. The back of the mantua was often pleated, and the train extended dramatically behind the wearer. With this came new developments in corsetry. Stays were worn to flatten the torso, push up the bust, and mold the body into the fashionable conical shape. Fabrics were the essence of Baroque richness. The importation of silks from Lyon, China, and Persia, and the increased production of European brocades, gave garments a lustrous textural quality. Florals, arabesques, and stylized plant motifs dominated. Embroidery, done by hand, could take months or even years to complete on a single garment. Jewelry played a central role. Large pearl drop earrings, necklaces made from coral or jet, and brooches encrusted with gems were worn not just at the neck or wrist, but sewn into bodices, hats, and sleeves. Color choices during the Baroque period were intense and symbolic. Deep reds, midnight blues, rich golds, and stark whites, all were deployed in deliberate contrast. Catholic nations favored grandeur and visual opulence. Protestant regions, especially in Northern Europe, cultivated a more restrained but still elegant palette. In Dutch portraiture, for example, black garments served as a symbol of wealth and dignity, their simplicity offset by the subtle sheen of fine wool or silk, and the brilliance of lace collars and cuffs. Children's clothing began to resemble adult fashion more closely in this period. Unlike in the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, where children were dressed in simplified versions of robes or tunics, the 17th century marked the rise of the miniature adult. Boys wore breeches, coats, and small wigs. Girls wore stays and structured gowns. This shift reflected changing ideas about childhood, not as a stage of innocence, but as an early period of training for adult roles. Fashion etiquette also expanded. The use of fans became essential for elite women, not only for cooling, but for gestural communication in social spaces. Gloves, snuff boxes, and beauty patches, small black spots worn on the face, became fashionable accessories, each with its own code. A patch worn on the cheek might signal flirtation, one near the mouth could suggest boldness. These items were as communicative as words, and understanding their meanings was a skill of the elite. Fashion print culture also grew. The circulation of fashion plates, engraved illustrations showing the latest court styles, helped spread trends from Paris and London to the courts of Germany, Poland, and Sweden. These prints were collected by tailors, courtiers, and aspiring nobles. They contributed to the early development of what we now call fashion cycles, the idea that styles changed seasonally and were subject to social pressure and novelty. At the heart of all Baroque fashion, however, was the concept of performance. Whether in royal processions, masks, salons, or daily rituals at court, clothing served to elevate the body beyond the mundane. It cast the wearer as a participant in a grand drama, a visual opera of identity and influence. Fashion was no longer just a sign of status. It was a script, a costume, and a claim to visibility in a world obsessed with spectacle. Rococo fashion, elegance, extravagance, and the theater of refinement. As the 18th century unfolded, the grandeur of the Baroque gave way to something lighter, more delicate, and altogether more playful. This was the Rococo era, often associated with the reign of Louis XV and the glittering world of the French aristocracy before the Revolution. If Baroque fashion was the sound of a church organ echoing in a vast cathedral, Rococo was the trill of a harpsichord in a gilded salon, refined, intimate, and designed to please the senses rather than overwhelm them. Rococo fashion embodied a deep love for pleasure, grace, and artifice. It celebrated sensuality, flirtation, and wit, qualities that defined the culture of elite salons, masquerade balls, and country retreats like the Petit Trianon. Clothing during this period was not merely a statement of power, but a language of emotional expression, delicate taste, and often intentional frivolity. For women, the iconic garment of this period was the robe à la Française, also known as the sackback gown. At first glance, it appeared loose and flowing, with fabric cascading in graceful pleats from the shoulders to the floor. But in reality, it was a carefully constructed ensemble, worn over tightly fitted stays and wide panniers, side hoops that extended the skirt dramatically outwards, especially at the hips. The silhouette was extravagant yet controlled, with the front of the gown open to reveal an elaborately decorated stomacher and matching petticoat. The fabrics used were often pastel or pale in tone, pale blue, blush pink, lavender, mint, and ivory, and decorated with floral patterns, stripes, or delicate embroidery. Silk, taffetas, satins, and brocades were favored for their lightness and sheen, especially when they moved in candlelight. Trimmings were essential: ribbons, lace, ruching, bows, and artificial flowers adorned every edge, sleeve, and hem. Gowns were not just worn, they were composed like paintings, each element contributing to an overall effect of elegance, grace, and visual delight. Hairstyles became towering architectural feats in themselves. By the mid 18th century, aristocratic women wore their hair high and elaborately powdered. Hairstyles were often adorned with feathers, miniature ships, birds, fruit baskets, or allegorical symbols reflecting love, nature, or current events. The famous coiffure à la belle poule, featuring a model warship, was a patriotic nod to naval battles. Women spent hours preparing their hair, or more often, had hairdressers and assistants maintain elaborate wigs that might be reused for weeks with careful preservation. Men's fashion, though still rooted in the Baroque tradition of the juste corps, evolved toward a more tapered, elegant form. The habit à la Française, composed of a fitted coat, waistcoat, and breeches, became standard. Men's coats shortened slightly and were more tailored at the back, emphasizing posture and movement. Embroidery moved from the whole coat to just the edges, giving garments a refined frame. Powdered wigs were still worn, but in smaller, more controlled styles. The queue, a ponytail tied with a black ribbon, and side curls called buckles, became popular among fashionable men. Colors were lighter and more playful than in earlier decades. Men in pink, pale blue, lemon yellow, or silver gray were not uncommon in aristocratic circles. Footwear reflected the Rococo love for delicacy and detail. Men and women wore heeled shoes, often with curved Louis heels, made of leather or silk, and decorated with embroidery or buckles. Women's shoes might be covered in the same fabric as their gown. Men's shoes featured polished leather and metal buckles, with red heels remaining a French courtly symbol. Accessories in the Rococo world were central to the overall effect. Fans were painted with mythological or pastoral scenes and used to send subtle social signals. Gloves were made of soft kid leather. Perfume was essential, and patches or mouches, artificial beauty marks, continued to be used not only to cover blemishes, but to emphasize the expressiveness of the face. Each patch had a name and could signify moods or intentions. A patch near the mouth might denote flirtation, one near the eye could signal passion or mischief. Children's clothing was slowly evolving. While elite children still wore miniature versions of adult dress, Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau began to advocate for clothing appropriate to childhood's natural freedom. This idea would have a more dramatic impact in the coming decades, especially after the Revolution. The Rococo aesthetic was not merely visual, it was philosophical. It rejected the heavy absolutism of the previous century and embraced pleasure, wit, and art for art's sake. But the very extravagance of Rococo fashion, its cost, its impracticality, its aristocratic frivolity, also sowed the seeds of its downfall. As the century neared its end, political unrest, philosophical upheaval, and changing economic realities brought the Rococo dream crashing down. The French Revolution marked not only the fall of a monarchy, but the symbolic death of powdered wigs, panniers, and embroidered silks. Clothing would soon be democratized, simplified, and radically redefined. The 19th century industrialization, identity, and the democratization of fashion. With the dawn of the 19th century came the rise of industrialization, nationalism, urbanization, and the middle class, forces that would reshape not only how clothing was made and worn, but what it meant. This century was a time of extreme contrasts. Revolutionary simplicity gave way to Victorian conservatism, while new machinery revolutionized textile production and distribution. Fashion, for the first time in history, became mass consumable. In the wake of the French Revolution, a desire for simplicity and natural beauty shaped the early decades. Women's clothing in the Regency era, circa 1795 1820, reflected this shift. The elaborate panniers and corsets of the Ancien Regime gave way to the Empire silhouette, high-waisted gowns made of light, flowing fabrics such as muslin, gauze, and fine cotton. Inspired by classical antiquity, these dresses hugged the bust and fell straight to the floor, evoking the robes of Greek goddesses. Sleeves were often short and puffed, and shawls imported from India were draped over the shoulders to complete the look. Men's clothing, too, became more restrained and structured. The dandy emerged as a new cultural figure, a man who paid meticulous attention to style, grooming, and posture. Figures like Beau Brummel popularized tailored, understated fashion. Dark wool coats, crisp white shirts, cravats tied just so, and perfectly fitted breeches or trousers. This new masculine ideal emphasized cleanliness, discipline, and modest elegance, a dramatic departure from the ornamental fashions of the previous century. The Industrial Revolution radically changed how clothing was made. Factories replaced workshops, and the mechanization of spinning, weaving, and dyeing made textiles more affordable and available. The sewing machine, patented in the mid 19th century, transformed clothing production by enabling faster and more standardized garment construction. Ready-made clothing began to appear, especially for men's workwear and military uniforms, laying the foundation for the modern fashion industry. Throughout the 19th century, women's fashion moved in cycles of expansion and constraint. After the simplicity of the empire style, skirts began to widen once more. By the 1830s, dresses featured gigot sleeves, enormous puffed sleeves, balanced by tightly corseted waists and full skirts. By the 1850s, skirts were supported by crinolines, cage-like structures made of steel hoops. These allowed for massive bell-shaped gowns that required several yards of fabric, marking the peak of Victorian opulence. Corsets returned in full force, tightly shaping the waist into an exaggerated hourglass. Hair was parted in the middle and smoothed into buns or braids. Day dresses were modest, with high collars and long sleeves. Evening dresses allowed for lower necklines and bare shoulders. Colors became darker and richer, especially in morning dress, which followed strict codes based on time and social status. Queen Victoria's long mourning after the death of Prince Albert helped entrench black as a fashionable and respectable color. Men's fashion, meanwhile, continued along the path of sobriety. The suit, consisting of a frock coat, waistcoat, and trousers, became the universal uniform of the respectable gentleman. Top hats, pocket watches, and gloves completed the ensemble. By the end of the century, the sack suit had begun to emerge, a looser, more practical style that foreshadowed the modern business suit. Beneath all these changes was a growing globalization of fashion. The expansion of European empires brought not only new materials and labor systems, but also new aesthetic influences. Paisley shawls from Kashmir, cotton from India, and inspiration from Chinese and Japanese textiles all found their way into European wardrobes. Yet this globalization was not equal. It was rooted in colonialism, exploitation, and cultural appropriation. Magazines and department stores became powerful new forces in shaping fashion trends. Publications like Godey's Ladies' Book in America or La Mode Illustrée in France brought illustrated fashion plates to middle class households, democratizing style and encouraging consumerism. Department stores like Le Bon Marché in Paris revolutionized shopping by offering a wide selection of goods, fixed prices, and seasonal collections. For the first time, women could shop not only for necessities, but for novelty, variety, and self expression. Fashion in the 19th century became increasingly tied to gender roles and morality. Women's clothing emphasized domesticity, modesty, and social restraint, while men's dress reflected professionalism, sobriety, and control. Yet, even as fashion reinforced traditional roles, it also created spaces for rebellion, experimentation, and individual identity, themes that would erupt more fully in the early 20th century. Bodices remained tightly fitted and were often boned and reinforced to create a smooth, corseted torso. The waist was drawn inward to its narrowest point, sometimes reaching as little as 18 inches in circumference. This was not without controversy. The so-called tight lacing debate emerged in both medical journals and women's periodicals, questioning whether the pursuit of an ever smaller waist was healthy or ethical. Yet despite criticism, the hourglass ideal dominated both fashion and visual art, appearing in photography, illustration, and painting alike. Sleeves began to grow again in the 1890s, swelling into puffed leg of mutton styles that echoed earlier romantic trends. Necklines during the day rose to cover the neck completely, often accented by high collars, lace insets, and decorative brooches. In the evening, however, necklines dropped, sometimes dramatically, as décolletage returned to fashion. Fabrics were rich but increasingly standardized. Velvet, silk, fine wool, and high-quality cottons were common among the upper and middle classes. Trimmings such as fringe, beading, tassels, and applique reflected the growing obsession with ornamentation. Men's fashion, by contrast, followed a path of increasing restraint and sobriety. The three-piece suit, consisting of trousers, waistcoat, and coat, became universal. The earlier frock coat gave way to shorter, more practical designs such as the morning coat and eventually the sack suit, which would become the basis for the modern business suit. Colors were muted: gray, navy, brown, and black predominated. Fabrics were heavy and durable, reflecting both the colder climate of urban Europe and the moral seriousness associated with masculinity. Facial hair flourished. Beards, sideburns, and mustaches were seen as signs of virility, wisdom, and stability, especially in an age when industrial capitalism demanded a new image of respectable manhood. Hats were mandatory in public, bowler hats for the working class, top hats for formal wear, and Homburgs, or boaters for summer leisure. Children's fashion continued to mimic adult styles, though reforms were on the horizon. Middle and upper class boys wore sailor suits, velvet jackets, or knickerbockers with high stockings. Girls wore simplified versions of women's dresses, complete with corsets and petticoats. Yet a growing movement, including child psychologists, educators, and reformers, began to argue that children needed clothing that allowed for growth, comfort, and play. One of the most revolutionary developments of the late 19th century was the rise of haute couture, literally high sewing or high fashion. In the 1850s, Charles Frederick Worth, an English designer working in Paris, established the first fashion house. He designed custom gowns for wealthy clients, especially aristocrats and actresses, and began the practice of presenting seasonal collections on live models called mannequins. For the first time, a named designer, not a faceless seamstress, became the creative authority behind a woman's wardrobe. Worth's designs were theatrical, luxurious, and carefully tailored. He chose the fabrics, dictated the silhouettes, and oversaw every detail. His clients did not commission garments, they selected from his vision. This marked a profound shift in the nature of fashion. The designer now shaped the trend. The fashion house became a creative and commercial entity, and Paris cemented its role as the capital of global style. Following Worth's success, other fashion houses emerged. Jean Paquin, Callot-Sur, and later Paul Poiret began to influence the upper echelons of society. But even as haute couture thrived, ready-made clothing continued its rapid expansion. Department stores across Europe and the United States, from Harrods in London to Macy's in New York, sold off-the-rack garments to a burgeoning middle class. Mail-order catalogs like Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward reached rural customers, bringing the latest trends to remote areas. The growth of photography and fashion journalism further accelerated this process. Women's magazines such as The Delineator, Harper's Bazaar, and La Belle Assemblée offered illustrations, sewing patterns, and style advice. The middle class, no longer mere spectators of elite fashion, became active participants in shaping it. They interpreted trends, adapted them, and expressed personal identity through dress. Fashion was also politicized. The dress reform movement, especially in Britain and America, challenged the restrictive nature of women's clothing. Figures like Amelia Bloomer and Elizabeth Smith Miller proposed alternative garments, such as the Bloomer costume, loose trousers worn under a tunic. Though ridiculed at the time, these ideas laid the groundwork for future shifts toward comfort and practicality in women's fashion. By the turn of the century, the world was changing at an astonishing pace. Cities were growing, technology was advancing, and mass media was reshaping consciousness. The fashion world stood at a crossroads, caught between tradition and innovation, elegance and efficiency, art and industry. The 20th century would bring radical transformations, liberation, experimentation, rebellion, and reinvention. But before that came the twilight of the Victorian world, the Edwardian era, named after King Edward VII, who reigned in Britain from 1901 to 1910. Though short-lived, the Edwardian period ushered in a final flourish of opulence and grace before the First World War shattered the old order. The Edwardian era, the swan song of aristocratic elegance. In the years between 1900 and the outbreak of the First World War, fashion entered one of its most elegant and romantic phases. The Edwardian silhouette, often called the S curve, dominated women's dress. This ideal involved a tightly corseted waist pushed forward and a full, rounded bust thrust upward and outward, while the hips were swept backward. The result was a posture that created the visual illusion of a graceful, elongated figure, almost like a swan in profile. The corset during this time was specifically designed to create this shape. It was longer than in previous decades, curving over the hips and made of whalebone, steel, or cording. The look was refined, polished, and extremely formal. Gowns featured high necklines, lace blouses, and long flowing skirts that brushed the floor. Daywear was demure and modest, while evening gowns could be daringly low cut in back and adorned with beading or embroidery. One of the key innovations of the Edwardian period was the tailor made suit for women, a structured jacket worn over a long skirt. It became popular among upper middle class women, particularly for travel, walking, or visiting public spaces. These suits marked a quiet step toward practicality and autonomy, signaling that women were increasingly visible in public life. The Edwardian man's wardrobe continued to emphasize tailored elegance, morning coats, waistcoats, detachable collars, and cravats. The dinner jacket or tuxedo emerged as a less formal alternative to the tailcoat. Leisure wear, such as blazers, boaters, and striped trousers, began to signal weekend or sporting activity as social life expanded into clubs, resorts, and racetracks. Hats reached their apex in the Edwardian period. Women wore enormous, wide brimmed hats festooned with feathers, artificial flowers, tulle, and even taxidermied birds. Millinery was a thriving industry. Men wore stiff brimmed bowlers, fedoras, or Panama hats, depending on the occasion. Fashion photography and fashion shows became more important, especially in Paris. Designers like Lucille, Lady Duff Gordon, Jean Lanvin, and Paul Poiret began to break away from the rigid traditions of earlier couture. Poiret, in particular, rejected the corset and embraced loose, draped garments inspired by Middle Eastern and classical styles, a revolutionary gesture that paved the way for modernism. By 1910, the cracks in the old world were beginning to show. Suffragettes marched in the streets. Artists rejected realism. Philosophers questioned the certainties of Victorian morality. And in the world of fashion, the next great transformation was already on the horizon. The 20th century fashion in the age of acceleration, 1900s, the Edwardian era, and the last breath of old elegance. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it the final echoes of 19th century grandeur. In Britain, the Edwardian era, 1901-1910, named after King Edward VII, was a time of luxury for the upper classes, but also increasing social change. Fashion during this decade was defined by opulence, formality, and a deep emphasis on class distinction. Women's clothing featured the famous S-bend corset, which forced the hips backward and the chest forward, creating what was then considered the ideal feminine posture. Long skirts swept the ground, and bodices were heavily structured. Dresses were made of fine fabrics such as silk, satin, and chiffon, and were often layered with lace and embroidery. Parasols, gloves, and ornate hats completed the look. This was the height of the Gibson girl aesthetic, a stylized image of the independent but graceful modern woman. Men's fashion remained conservative. The three-piece suit had become standard, matching trousers, waistcoat, and jacket. Morning coats and tailcoats were worn for formal events, and bowler hats or top hats were common in urban centers. The silhouette was trim, and dark colors dominated. However, cracks were forming beneath this surface of elegance. The industrial working class was growing rapidly, and their clothing was based on practicality. Flat caps, wool trousers, and buttoned shirts were typical for men. Women wore simple skirts, aprons, and blouses, clothing that reflected both necessity and social position. 1910s. War, reform, and the fall of corsets. The 1910s were marked by World War I and the accompanying social and political upheaval. As millions of men went to war, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. This shift had a dramatic impact on women's clothing. Corsets began to fall out of favor, replaced by more flexible undergarments that allowed freer movement. Hemlines rose slightly, and skirts became narrower to allow for walking. Materials like wool and cotton became more common, as silk was diverted to the war effort. Colors were muted, gray, navy, and olive, reflecting the seriousness of the time. A defining silhouette of the era was the hobble skirt, which was narrow at the hem and made long strides impossible. Though impractical, it showed that even as functionality increased, style remained paramount. Men's fashion adapted to military trends. Trench coats, originally developed for officers, became civilian outerwear staples. Uniform cuts, epaulets, and khaki tones filtered into everyday dress. Tailoring remained essential, but practicality became a greater priority. The war also led to a general democratization of fashion. As resources were rationed and everyone contributed to the war effort, extravagant fashion was seen as unpatriotic. This marked the beginning of a shift toward the more casual and simplified styles that would define the rest of the century. 1920s. Flappers, freedom, and modernity. The end of the war ushered in the Roaring Twenties, a decade of exuberance, jazz, and radical social change. Women gained the right to vote in many countries, and young people embraced a lifestyle that rejected the formalities of the past. Fashion followed suit. The iconic flapper look emerged, short bobbed hair, cloche hats, and knee-length dresses that hung straight from the shoulders with minimal waist definition. This style symbolized liberation from corsets, from tradition, and from restrictive gender norms. Fabrics were lighter, and clothing was designed for movement, particularly dancing. Beads, sequins, fringe, and Art Deco patterns adorned evening wear. Day wear often included loose blouses, pleated skirts, and dropped waists. Makeup became fashionable for the first time. Women painted their lips red, lined their eyes, and used face powder to achieve a pale look. Men's fashion also relaxed slightly. Lounge suits became standard daily wear, and tuxedos replaced tailcoats for evening events. Oxford bags, wide-legged trousers, became popular among university students. Hair was slicked back with pomade, and straw boater hats or fedoras were fashionable. The 1920s represented a major cultural shift, one that positioned fashion as a medium of youth, rebellion, and self-expression. 1930s. Glamour and the Great Depression. The 1930s were shaped by the Great Depression, a global economic crisis that affected every aspect of life, including fashion. Luxury was out of reach for most people, but Hollywood provided a glamorous escape. Stars like Greta Garbo and Jean Harlow inspired women's styles with their elegance and poise. Fashion became more conservative and mature compared to the free-spirited 1920s. Hemlines dropped again, waistlines returned, and the silhouette became more tailored. Bias-cut dresses, which hugged the natural lines of the body, were popularized by designers like Madeleine Vionnet. Shoulders were emphasized, often with padding or ruffles, and gowns featured backless designs or dramatic draping for evening wear. Men's fashion remained relatively stable. Suits continued to be worn daily, but they became slightly broader at the shoulders and more structured. The double-breasted suit came into style, often with wide lapels and pinstripes. Hats, especially fedoras and trilbies, were almost universally worn outdoors. Due to economic constraints, clothing was expected to last. Many families mended and repurposed garments. Sewing at home became a necessity, and women learned to be resourceful, a trend that would intensify during the next decade. 1940s. War and utility. World War II defined the 1940s. As in the 1910s, the war effort impacted fashion profoundly. In Europe and the US, governments implemented rationing systems for fabric, limiting the amount and type of material available for civilian clothing. This gave rise to the utility look, practical, simple, and uniform. Women wore suit-like dresses, often with squared shoulders, nipped waists, and knee-length skirts. Trousers became more common for the women working in factories, farms, and offices. Make do and mend was a widespread motto, encouraging people to reuse and alter old garments. Men's fashion was dominated by military uniforms. Soldiers wore standardized gear, trench coats, boots, wool trousers, and caps that later influenced post-war civilian styles. For those not in the military, rationing also meant simplified tailoring, limited pockets, and minimal decoration. In Nazi-occupied Europe, fashion became a quiet form of resistance. French couture houses struggled to survive. In the US, zoot suits, oversized, flamboyant ensembles worn by many African American and Latino youth became politically controversial and symbolized defiance against conformity. By the end of the war, people longed for color, abundance, and elegance again, and that desire would explode in the next decade. 1950s, the new look, domesticity, and Cold War elegance. The 1950s began with a powerful desire for stability, prosperity, and a return to traditional values following the devastation of World War II. In fashion, this manifested as a revival of opulence and hyperfemininity, a stark contrast to the rationed, utilitarian clothing of the 1940s. The most iconic moment came in 1947, when French designer Christian Dior introduced what he called the new look. This revolutionary silhouette featured rounded shoulders, a cinched waist, and full, voluminous skirts that flared out dramatically. The look was both nostalgic and forward-looking, recalling the elegance of earlier eras while celebrating abundance and glamour. It quickly spread across the Western world and came to define the entire decade. Women's fashion in the 1950s was all about sculpting the body into the idealized hourglass shape. Underneath those graceful dresses were bullet bras, girdles, corsets, petticoats, and garters, all designed to enhance curves and maintain structure. Skirts came in two main shapes: the full circle skirt supported by crinolines, and the pencil skirt which hugged the hips and emphasized the legs. Blouses, cardigans, and twin sets became everyday staples. Color palettes included soft pastels, baby blue, pale pink, mint green, polka dots, floral prints, and novelty motifs. Gloves, pearls, cat-eye sunglasses, and structured handbags completed the quintessential lady look. Hairstyles were carefully coiffed, short curls, victory rolls, or bouffants. At the same time, fashion also reinforced domestic ideals. Magazines and television promoted the image of the perfectly dressed housewife. Aprons, once purely functional, became fashion items in their own right, ruffled, embroidered, even color-coordinated to match dresses. Men's fashion remained relatively formal, but modernized. The standard daily attire was the business suit, often gray or navy, with broad shoulders and narrow waists, paired with a crisp white shirt and tie. The Ivy League look became popular among younger men, featuring button-down Oxford shirts, chinos, loafers, and crew neck sweaters. But even amid all this conformity, Seeds of rebellion were planted. The emergence of teenagers as a cultural force led to new styles. Influenced by rock and roll stars like Elvis Presley and James Dean, young men began wearing jeans, leather jackets, and white t shirts, clothing that was once considered undergarments or workwear. The greaser subculture was born, and with it, the idea that fashion could express resistance and individuality. The 1950s represented a pivotal moment in fashion history, a time when global recovery from the trauma of World War II was underway, and societies across the Western world were striving to restore a sense of normalcy, affluence, and structure. This return to order and tradition was perhaps nowhere more visible than in the realm of clothing. In the immediate aftermath of the war, fabric rationing and utilitarian styles had shaped fashion for nearly a decade. Clothing was primarily practical, with little room for extravagance or creativity. But as economies recovered and consumer confidence surged, a new desire emerged. People wanted beauty, femininity, and elegance once again. Women in particular sought clothing that celebrated the body, rather than concealed or restricted it. One of the most iconic contributions to this decade's style revolution came from French couturier Christian Dior, whose 1947 collection, titled Corolle, but famously dubbed the New Look by fashion editors, marked the beginning of a fashion renaissance. Dior's designs reintroduced luxury and drama to women's wardrobes. His signature silhouette featured rounded, sloping shoulders, a narrow, tightly cinched waist, and voluminous, mid calf length skirts, often requiring yards upon yards of expensive fabric, a dramatic reversal from wartime frugality. This was not just a new aesthetic, it was a cultural statement. In Dior's hands, fashion became a tool for post war healing, a way for women to, to reclaim their sensuality, social presence, and joy in dress. The extravagance of his designs reasserted the notion of the feminine ideal, albeit one still shaped by patriarchal notions of beauty and decorum. The feminine hourglass silhouette defined the 1950s, but it came at a structural cost. Beneath the smooth lines and graceful movement of the dresses, women wore a battery of foundation garments, girdles, corsets, petticoats, structured bras, and crinolines that sculpted and held the body in place. Fashion in this era demanded both form and discipline. The popular wasp waist required intense shaping, and bullet bras pushed the bust into a pointy, high position, creating a highly stylized upper torso. These undergarments were not simply hidden architecture, they represented a particular vision of idealized femininity, one that emphasized order, cleanliness, control, and distinction from the masculine form. Everyday wear for women varied according to class, region, and occasion, but certain staples were universal. Day dresses featured demure necklines, tailored bodices, and full skirts. Fabrics ranged from cotton and rayon for casual day wear to silk and taffeta for evening or formal wear. Floral prints, novelty patterns, gingham, and pastel colors dominated wardrobes. A woman's outfit would often be accessorized with a small hat, gloves, pearl necklaces, and kitten-heeled shoes. Outerwear included smart tailored coats, often with fur collars or cuffs, and elegant clutch handbags. Hair was meticulously styled with short curls, poodle cuts, or chignons, and makeup emphasized a clean, vibrant look. Rosy cheeks, cat eye eyeliner, and especially red lipstick, which became a symbol of mature femininity. The 1950s also ushered in an era of fashion that was closely intertwined with the domestic ideal. In the post war years, particularly in the United States and Western Europe, the image of the content, stylish housewife was omnipresent in advertising, television, and women's magazines. Shows like Leave It to Beaver and The Donna Reed Show depicted women as happy homemakers who always wore pressed dresses, styled hair, and full makeup, even while vacuuming. Fashion was both a tool and a symbol in the performance of domestic femininity. The apron, once a practical garment for protecting clothes, became a decorative item, often embroidered or trimmed with lace. It served as a metaphor for the woman's role, beautiful, restrained, and centered within the private sphere. Meanwhile, men's fashion in the 1950s emphasized uniformity, respectability, and authority. The post war boom elevated the corporate businessman as an aspirational figure. The standard wardrobe included a dark wool suit in navy, gray, or black, a white dress shirt, a conservative tie, leather dress shoes, and often a fedora. The overall silhouette was structured with padded shoulders, single or double breasted jackets, and high waisted pleated trousers. While it may appear unremarkable in hindsight, this uniformity carried deep cultural meaning. In an era shaped by Cold War anxieties, political conformity and visual neatness were seen as virtues. Outside the office, leisure wear allowed slightly more personal expression. Cardigans, short sleeve button up shirts, argyle patterns, and casual slacks became standard weekend fare. Teenagers, a newly emerging demographic category, both sociologically and economically, began to develop their own style codes. Rebellion came in the form of blue jeans, white t shirts, and leather jackets. Films like Rebel Without a Cause made James Dean an icon of youthful discontent. The greaser look, with its slicked back hair, denim, and motorcycles, became a way for working class young men to differentiate themselves from middle class conformity. By the end of the decade, fashion had become both a mirror of social norms and a canvas for cultural shifts. The seeds of later rebellion had already been planted, but in the 1950s, style was largely about returning to idealized gender roles, celebrating consumption, and reflecting the optimism and anxieties of the atomic age. 1960s, youthquake, revolution, and the rise of counterculture. The 1960s were a decade of upheaval, socially, politically, and sartorially. The post war baby boom produced a generation of young people who no longer wanted to dress like their parents. Fashion was no longer dictated from the top down. Instead, it began to bubble up from the streets, led by youth culture, music, and the rapidly changing world. The early part of the decade still echoed 1950s formality. Boxy suits, pillbox hats, and conservative lines were the norm, especially under the influence of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, whose style became iconic around the world. Women wore elegant sheath dresses, A-line skirts, gloves, and pearls, creating a look that was polished and refined. By the mid 1960s, however, a radical shift took hold. The mod movement in London led the way with bold, geometric designs, short mini skirts, go-go boots, and bright, clashing colors. Designers like Mary Quant and André Courrèges rejected the restrictions of traditional fashion and embraced youth, energy, and futurism. Fabrics such as PVC, vinyl, and metallics entered the mainstream. The miniskirt became one of the most controversial and celebrated garments of the era, symbolic of women's liberation, sexual freedom, and generational defiance. Hairstyles also evolved. Pixie cuts, beehives, and long straight hair parted in the middle all had their moments. Makeup became bolder, with heavy eyeliner, false lashes, and pastel eyeshadows defining the doll-like aesthetic. Men's fashion loosened up too. The decade saw the rise of peacock fashion, with vibrant colors, flared trousers, wide lapels, and paisley shirts becoming fashionable for young men. The Beatles influenced everything from collarless jackets to mop-top haircuts. Toward the end of the decade, the hippie movement introduced yet another dramatic change. Inspired by Eastern philosophy, environmentalism, and anti establishment politics. Hippie fashion included tie dye shirts, bell bottom jeans, fringed vests, headbands, and ethnic prints. Clothing was often handmade or secondhand, rejecting consumerism in favor of self expression and spirituality. 1970s disco, decay, and subcultural explosion. The 1970s were a paradoxical decade, both flamboyant and decaying, marked by economic downturns and social fragmentation, but also incredible creativity in fashion. No single style defined the era, instead, a chaotic mixture of subcultures, music scenes, and ideological currents created a dazzling and sometimes clashing tapestry of style. At the start of the decade, hippie aesthetics remained popular: earth tones, peasant blouses, maxi skirts, and natural fibers like cotton and hemp. Unisex fashion thrived, blurring traditional gender boundaries. Bell bottom pants, often paired with platform shoes, were worn by both men and women. By the mid 70s, disco had taken over. Nightclubs like Studio 54 became fashion catwalks, where glitter, lame, sequins, and body hugging fabrics ruled. Jumpsuits, halter tops, and wrap dresses, popularized by Diane von Furstenberg, defined the dance floor. The disco era emphasized sensuality and glamour, with shiny materials reflecting the lights and the hedonism of the moment. At the same time, a darker and more aggressive subculture was forming: punk. In London, designers like Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren used fashion to shock and provoke. Punk style included ripped shirts, safety pins, spiked hair, leather jackets, and combat boots. Clothes were often DIY, customized with slogans, patches, or studs. Punk rejected the polished consumerism of disco, embracing instead rebellion, nihilism, and raw authenticity. Men's fashion in the 70s was equally experimental, from wide collars and polyester suits to leisure suits in pastel colors. Men were encouraged to explore style and individuality like never before. Long hair, mustaches, and beards became mainstream. 1980s. Power dressing, excess, and the designer boomed. The 1980s were defined by capitalism, ambition, and image. The decade was shaped by Reaganomics, Wall Street, consumerism, and the rise of mass media. Fashion reflected this high stakes, high gloss culture with dramatic silhouettes, luxury branding, and conspicuous consumption. One of the key trends of the era was power dressing, particularly for women entering corporate spaces. Shoulder pads, structured blazers, and knee length pencil skirts projected authority and competence. The message was clear: women could dress like men, but better. Designers like Giorgio Armani, Donna Karan, and Calvin Klein helped define the businesswoman aesthetic. At the same time, fashion exploded with color and excess. Neon tones, metallics, and geometric patterns were everywhere. Leg warmers, spandex, crop tops, and off the shoulder sweatshirts were made popular by aerobics culture and films like Flashdance. The influence of MTV and music videos brought fashion to the forefront of pop culture. Artists like Madonna, Prince, and Michael Jackson became style icons in their own right. Designer labels became status symbols. Logos were worn proudly: Versace, Chanel, Lacoste, Guess, and Yves Saint Laurent were as important for their branding as for their designs. The fashion industry itself became glamorized, with supermodels like Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista, and Claudia Schiffer becoming household names. Men's fashion reflected similar excesses. Sharp suits, suspenders, and slicked back hair defined the Wall Street aesthetic. But men also experimented more than ever, wearing pastel suits, parachute pants, denim on denim, and athleisure inspired looks. The Miami Vice look, blazers over t shirts, rolled up sleeves, epitomized casual cool. 1990s, minimalism, grunge, and the end of century cool. The 1990s arrived like a cold shower after the fever dream of the 80s. The mood shifted from maximalism to minimalism, from wealth to irony, from structure to slouch. The rise of technology, the internet, and a new sense of global awareness began reshaping fashion once again. At one end of the spectrum was minimalist chic. Designers like Calvin Klein, Jill Sonder, and Helmut Lang promoted clean lines, neutral colors, and understated luxury. Slip dresses, turtlenecks, and tailored trousers became fashionable in their simplicity. The heroin chic aesthetic, pale skin, dark circles, and lanky frames, dominated high fashion photography, most controversially embodied by models like Kate Moss. At the opposite end was grunge, a movement rooted in music and youth culture, particularly in Seattle. Inspired by bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam, grunge fashion rejected polish and embraced decay, flannel shirts, ripped jeans, combat boots, oversized sweaters, and greasy hair. The look was intentionally disheveled, anti fashion, and accessible. Streetwear also began its ascent, particularly in urban centers. Influenced by hip hop, skateboarding, and sports culture, brands like Tommy Hilfiger, Fubu, Nike, and Adidas became everyday fashion staples. Gender norms in fashion continued to blur. Androgyny became fashionable. Women wore suits, men wore eyeliner. Unisex clothing gained ground, as did the idea that style didn't have to conform to gendered expectations. The 1990s also saw the global explosion of fast fashion. Retailers like Zara, H&M, and Forever 21 began replicating high fashion trends at low cost and high speed. This marked the beginning of a new era in fashion, one of speed, volume, and disposability. As we draw our journey to a close, we're left with a simple yet profound realization. Clothing is far more than fabric, thread, or ornament. It is the living record of human civilization, a mirror held up to each age, reflecting its hopes, its fears, its structures, and its spirit. From the woven linen robes of ancient Egypt to the opulent silks of Renaissance courts, from the lace collars of Puritan austerity to the extravagant gowns of a Versailles, from the somber suits of industrial capitalism to the explosive creativity of the modern runway. Every stitch tells a story. Fashion has always been about more than beauty. It has been about power, who possesses it, and who is denied it. It has been about gender, shaping how we define masculinity and femininity. It has been about class, separating those who could afford the latest styles from those who could only watch them pass by. And it has been about change, constant, inevitable, and often surprising. As materials evolved from wool and linen to synthetic fibers and smart textiles, so too did the meaning of dress. What once required months of labor can now be purchased in minutes. What once declared loyalty to a monarch or a religion now signals individual identity, protest, or belonging. In the modern world, fashion moves faster than ever before. Yet, at its core, it remains deeply human, a way of saying, this is who I am, this is where I stand, this is how I feel. And though trends will come and go, what endures is the need to express, to connect, and to be seen. So the next time you fasten a button, sip a coat, or slip on a pair of shoes, remember you are part of a story that stretches back thousands of years. You are wrapped in memory, draped in meaning, dressed in history. Thank you for walking through it with me tonight.